My wife died years ago. Every month I sent her mom $300. Until I found out. For 5 years, Jerome Williams never forgot his duty. Despite financial struggles, he faithfully sent $300 to his mother-in-law Diane every month, a final promise to Keisha before she passed from cancer. But when Jerome began questioning strange transactions in the account, he uncovered a horrifying truth. Everything he believed about his wife's death and his obligation to her mother wasn't what it seemed. The monthly payments weren't supporting a grieving elderly woman. They were feeding a dark secret that had stolen years of his life and thousands of his hard-earned dollars. Now Jerome faced a decision that could change everything. Before we dive into this shocking story, subscribe to the channel so you're always first to know. Hit like if you're ready for the next revelation, and comment where you're watching from. New York City, Los Angeles, or maybe Chicago, all right? Let's continue with Jerome as he discovers the truth about his monthly payments. Jerome Williams stood at his kitchen counter, staring at the bank transfer confirmation on his phone screen. $300. Same amount, same day, same recipient, account number he'd memorized by heart. The 5th anniversary of this routine had passed 2 months ago, yet his fingers still hesitated over the send button every month. Not because he questioned the obligation, Keisha had made him promise, and a promise to a dying wife was sacred, but because each payment felt like reopening a wound that never quite healed. The notification sound pulled him back to the present. Another bill reminder. Electric company this time, threatening disconnection if he didn't pay the $167 by Friday. Jerome scrolled through his banking app, watching his checking account balance hover dangerously close to zero. After rent, groceries, his daughter Zara's school supplies, and Diane's monthly support, there wasn't much left for emergencies. His electrician's salary was decent, but raising an 8-year-old alone in Chicago meant every dollar had a purpose. Every dollar except those $300 that disappeared into Diane Jefferson's account like clockwork. "Daddy, can we get pizza tonight?" Zara bounced into the kitchen, backpack still strapped to her small shoulders. Her smile was pure Keisha, bright, infectious, capable of making him forget his troubles for a moment. But tonight, even his daughter's joy couldn't shake the weight pressing down on his chest. Jerome crouched to her level, smoothing a hand over her braided hair. "How about we make grilled cheese instead? I picked up that fancy bread you like." Her face fell slightly, but she nodded with the resilience only children possessed. She'd learned not to ask for things they couldn't afford, and that broke his heart more than any bill ever could. The phone buzzed in his palm, a text from Diane Jefferson. "Need to discuss payment method. Call me tonight." Jerome frowned. In 5 years, she'd never wanted to discuss anything. She accepted the money with cold efficiency, never asking about Zara or acknowledging the sacrifice these payments represented. The rare times they'd spoken, her voice carried the same bitter edge it had held since Keisha's diagnosis, as if Jerome were somehow responsible for her daughter's death. As if his grief didn't matter because he'd gotten to keep living while Keisha hadn't. He pocketed the phone and helped Zara with her homework, but his mind kept circling back to that text. Something felt different, wrong maybe. Diane had always insisted on the direct deposit, claimed it was easier for her fixed income budget. She'd given him the account information scrawled on a piece of paper at Keisha's funeral, her hands shaking with what he'd assumed was grief. Now he wondered if it had been something else entirely. The signature on that paper. Had it even been Diane's handwriting? Jerome realized with uncomfortable clarity that he'd never questioned it, never verified, never asked to see her bank statements or wondered why a woman living on Social Security needed exactly $300 every month. No more, no less. As Zara settled into bed that night, Jerome found himself standing in his closet, staring at the small box of Keisha's belongings Diane had given him after the funeral. He'd barely touched it since then, too raw to handle physical reminders of what he'd lost. But tonight something compelled him to lift the lid, her wedding ring, a few photos they'd missed packing, her medical bracelet from the hospital, and at the bottom a business card from the funeral home with Diane's signature on the back. A note about picking up the cremation certificate. The handwriting looked nothing like the account information she'd given him. Nothing at all. Jerome set the box down carefully, his electrician's hand steady despite the tremor in his chest. For 5 years, he'd honored what he believed was Keisha's final wish. For 5 years, he'd sent money to support the woman who'd raised the love of his life. But looking at those two completely different handwriting samples, A cold realization crept through his bones. What if everything he'd believed about duty and obligation and keeping promises was built on something that wasn't true? What if Diane Jefferson had been lying to him from the very beginning? The bank transfer confirmation glowed on his nightstand, and for the first time since Keisha's death, Jerome Williams wondered if he'd been sending money to the wrong place entirely. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Troy Henderson knocked on Jerome's door at 7:30, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and concern etched across his weathered face. Troy had been Jerome's closest friend since high school, now working customer service at First National Bank. His presence this early meant business. Jerome accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Troy's usual easy smile was nowhere to be found. They settled on the front porch, watching Zara climb into the school bus before Troy finally spoke. "I need to tell you something about that account you've been sending money to." Troy's voice carried the weight of someone who'd wrestled with a decision all night. "I pulled up the transaction history after you mentioned Diane Jefferson. That account's been active way beyond what you'd expect from an elderly woman on a fixed income. Large deposits, frequent transfers, activity patterns that don't match someone just paying bills." Troy handed him a folded paper. "These are the transaction dates. I couldn't get details, privacy laws, but the pattern's all wrong." Jerome unfolded the paper, his electrician's eye for detail immediately catching the inconsistencies. Deposits of $800, $1,200, sometimes $2,000 appeared weekly. His $300 looked insignificant by comparison. But what made his stomach clench was the timing. Every deposit from him was transferred out within 24 hours to an account he didn't recognize. This wasn't money being used for living expenses. This was money being moved, laundered through Diane's account like water through a pipe. There's more. The address on file doesn't match what you gave me for Diane Jefferson. The account holder's address is Riverside Apartments on Oak Street, apartment 214. Troy's voice dropped lower. It's not a senior living facility. It's one of those short-term rental places, the kind people use when they don't want to be found. And the account activity spikes right around your monthly payment, like someone's expecting it and knows exactly what to do with it the minute it arrives. Jerome felt something cold settle in his chest. 5 years of faithful payments, and he'd never verified where the money actually went. Never visited Diane at her new address. Never questioned why a woman who'd barely tolerated him during Keisha's illness suddenly needed exactly $300 every month. When Keisha was alive, Diane had been financially independent, proud to the point of stubbornness about accepting help. The woman who'd refused to let them pay for groceries was now depending on his support. It had never made sense, but grief had a way of making senseless things seem reasonable. "I tried calling the number you gave me for her," Jerome admitted, pulling out his phone. "Goes straight to voicemail every time. Generic message, no name." Troy examined the phone number, then pulled out his own device. After searching, he looked up with grim news. This number's registered to a different name entirely, not Diane Jefferson. And according to public records, there's no Diane Jefferson at that Oak Street address. The apartment's been rented by someone else for the past 3 years. The words hung between them like smoke, filling the morning air with implications neither wanted to acknowledge. Jerome's coffee had gone cold, but he barely noticed. Every instinct he'd developed in 20 years of electrical work, the ability to spot faulty wiring, dangerous connections, systems that looked right but functioned wrong, was screaming that nothing about the situation was what it appeared to be. Troy stood up slowly, mixing friendship with professional concern. "Jerome, I think someone's been playing a long con on you. If I'm right about these transaction patterns, this isn't just about $300 a month." He handed Jerome a business card for a private investigator. "Marcus Reed. He specializes in financial fraud cases. Whatever's happening here, you need someone who knows how to trace money legally." Troy paused at the porch steps, his expression serious. "One more thing. That account's been receiving payments from at least 4 other sources. Monthly payments just like yours, all in different amounts. You might not be the only person getting scammed." As Troy's car disappeared down the street, Jerome sat alone with the transaction records spread across his lap. The numbers told a story he wasn't ready to hear but couldn't ignore. Somewhere in Chicago, someone was collecting money from multiple sources, using Diane Jefferson's name and his grief as tools in elaborate theft. The woman who'd raised Keisha, who'd held his hand at the funeral, who'd accepted his promise to take care of her, that woman might not exist at all. The morning sun felt cold against his skin as Jerome Williams realized he'd been feeding money to a ghost for 5 long years. Jerome spent the weekend wrestling with Troy's revelations, but Monday morning found him parked across from Riverside Apartments with newfound purpose. 5 years of struggling to honor what might be a false promise had changed something fundamental in his core. He wasn't here to confront anyone. He was here to see with his own eyes what $300 a month had been supporting. The apartment complex squatted between a laundromat and a check-cashing place, nothing suggesting senior living or somewhere Diane Jefferson would spend her golden years. Jerome approached the building manager with steady confidence his work had taught him. The manager, a tired man named Pete, barely glanced up when Jerome explained he was trying to locate his mother-in-law. Apartment 214? That's been rented by the same person for 3 years now. Quiet tenant, pays on time, keeps to herself. Pete pulled out a rental ledger, but it ain't no Diane Jefferson. Name on the lease is Keisha Williams. The words hit Jerome like voltage through faulty wiring. His hand gripped the counter as Pete continued, oblivious to the shock he'd delivered. Nice lady, maybe mid-30s. Keeps weird hours sometimes, but never causes trouble. Jerome forced his voice steady. Could I see the security footage from the lobby? Just to confirm if this is the person I'm looking for. Pete shrugged. Can't let you take hobbies, but if it helps you find your family. He led Jerome to a cramped office where a grainy monitor displayed the lobby entrance. Pete scrolled backward through timestamps, showing residents coming and going. Then Jerome saw her. The woman walking through the lobby moved with familiar grace that made his breath catch. Her hair was shorter, darker, but the way she tilted her head checking her phone was unmistakable. A gesture he'd watched 1,000 times across breakfast tables. The woman paused at mailboxes, and when she turned toward the camera, Jerome's world shifted. The face was older, thinner, but those eyes belonged to his wife. That's her, Pete said casually. Keisha Williams. Lives alone, far as I know. Gets visitors sometimes. Jerome stared at the timestamp 3 days ago. 3 days after he'd sent another payment to support a dead woman's mother. The woman who'd made him promise to care for Diane Jefferson was apparently alive and using her own name to collect payments meant for someone else. Pete scrolled through more footage showing Keisha entering and leaving over the past month. She looked healthy, vibrant, nothing like the cancer patient who'd wasted away in their bedroom. In one clip, she carried expensive grocery bags. In another, dressed for what looked like a date, laughing on her phone. This wasn't someone hiding from illness. This was someone living a completely different life while Jerome struggled to honor promises made to a person who'd never died. The security footage revealed other details that made Jerome's chest tighten. A man appeared in several clips with Keisha, his hand possessive on her back. Jerome didn't recognize him, but their intimacy was obvious. They moved like an established couple, comfortable in ways that spoke of long familiarity. In recent footage, Keisha's profile showed something that made Jerome's hands shake. The unmistakable curve of early pregnancy. She was building a new family while he sent monthly payments to support the fiction of her death. Jerome thanked Pete and walked to his truck on unsteady legs. The drive home passed in a blur of traffic and racing thoughts. Keisha was alive. His wife, mother of his child, the woman he'd grieved for 5 years, was living 20 minutes away under her own name. She was healthy, happy, pregnant with another man's child, and collecting his money through elaborate deception involving her mother. The weight pressed down like a collapsed beam, crushing and inescapable. That evening, after Zara was asleep, Jerome sat with Marcus Reed's business card. The private investigator answered on the second ring. I need to hire you, Jerome said without preamble. My wife faked her death 5 years ago, and I've been sending money to support her lie ever since. Marcus listened as Jerome explained the footage, the lease, the monthly payments that kept him struggling while Keisha built a new life. This is more common than you'd think, Marcus finally said. Life insurance fraud, staged deaths, disappearing acts. The hard part's getting evidence that holds up in court. If what you're telling me is true, we're looking at multiple felonies. Wire fraud, insurance fraud, identity theft at minimum. His tone grew serious. The question is, do you want to expose this for closure, or are you looking to press charges? Jerome stared out his kitchen window at the neighborhood where he'd raised Zara alone, where he'd struggled with bills while honoring a dead woman's wishes. The answer came easier than expected. He wanted the truth, whatever the wild, and he wanted the people who'd stolen 5 years of his life to face consequences. The woman on that security footage wasn't the wife he'd mourned. She was a stranger who'd weaponized his love and grief for profit. That stranger was about to discover that Jerome Williams was done being anyone's fool. Marcus Reed arrived Wednesday evening with a manila folder thick enough to stop a bullet. The private investigator spread documents across Jerome's kitchen table with methodical precision, each piece representing another crack in the foundation of what Jerome had believed for 5 years. The first document hit hardest. A hospital discharge summary dated 3 days before Keisha's supposed death, signed by a doctor Jerome had never heard of. Your wife was discharged from Mercy General on March 15, 2019. Alive, stable condition, released to family care. Marcus pointed to the signature line. The interesting part is who signed for her release. Diane Jefferson, listed as legal guardian due to patient's emotional distress and inability to make medical decisions. He pulled out another document. But here's the death certificate, filed the same day at a different hospital across town, signed by a doctor who had his license suspended 2 months later for falsifying records. Jerome stared at the papers, his mind trying to process the systematic nature of the deception. This wasn't desperate fear. This was planning, coordination, multiple people working together to erase Keisha Williams from existence while keeping her alive to profit from his grief. The hospital discharge showed her real signature, shaky but legible. The death certificate bore something that looked nothing like her handwriting. Someone had practiced forging her name, or Diane had signed for her daughter one final time. The cremation records get more interesting, Marcus continued, sliding another folder across the table. Riverside Funeral Home has no record of cremating Keisha Williams on the date listed in your paperwork, but they did cremate an unidentified woman the same day, a Jane Doe from the county morgue, paid for in cash by an anonymous donor. He paused to let that sink in. The urn you were given contains the ashes of a complete stranger. Your wife's mother handed you some random woman's remains and called it closure. The room felt smaller suddenly, walls closing in on Jerome's ability to breathe. He walked to the box of Keisha's belongings, the one Diane had given him after the funeral, and dumped its contents onto the table. Her wedding ring, too small for the fingers he remembered. Medical bracelet from a hospital stay he'd never heard about. Photos of them together that looked wrong somehow, like someone had replaced genuine memories with carefully staged replicas. Every piece of physical evidence he'd treasured as connection to his dead wife was revealing itself as part of an elaborate production. Marcus examined each item with professional detachment. The wedding ring's a fake, gold-plated, worth maybe $20. The real one probably got pawned years ago. He held up the medical bracelet. This is from a hospital in Florida, not Chicago. According to my research, your wife has been using variations of her real name in different states, probably testing new identities. The photos were next. These were printed on photo paper that wasn't manufactured until 2021, 2 years after she supposedly died. Jerome sank into his chair, the weight of systematic betrayal crushing down like a building collapse. Every memory he'd cherished, every moment of grief he'd worked through, every promise he'd kept to honor her legacy, all of it manipulated by someone who'd known exactly how to exploit his love. The woman he'd married, lived with for 10 years, created a child with, had studied him well enough to orchestrate his emotional responses from beyond what he'd believed was the grave. There's more. Marcus pulled out the final document, a life insurance payout statement. $50,000 paid to Diane Jefferson as beneficiary 4 months after the supposed death. Keisha changed the beneficiary from you to her mother 3 days before the staged death, citing marital difficulties in the paperwork. Jerome had never heard about marital difficulties. Their marriage had been solid, their future planned, their love genuine, at least on his part. Apparently, Keisha had been planning her escape while he'd been planning their anniversary celebration. The life insurance revelation explained everything and nothing. $50,000 was enough to start over, relocate, fund a new identity while maintaining the old one for monthly income. But it didn't explain why someone who'd claimed to love him would choose psychological torture over honest conversation. It didn't explain why Diane would collaborate in destroying the man who tried to care for her daughter's child. Money was the obvious motive, but the cruelty felt personal, targeted, designed to inflict maximum emotional damage over the longest possible time. Marcus closed the folder with the finality of a coffin lid. Tomorrow, I'm recommending we contact the FBI's white-collar crime division. This crosses state lines, involves federal wire fraud, and represents ongoing criminal enterprise. His voice carried the weight of experience with similar cases. But I need to ask you something. Are you prepared for what comes next? Once we expose this, there's no going back to the comfortable lie. Your daughter's going to learn her mother's alive and chose to abandon her. Your community's going to know you've been supporting a fraud. And Keisha's going to face federal charges that could put her away for decades. Jerome looked around his kitchen, at the home he'd maintained alone, at the photographs of Zara he'd hung to fill the emptiness left by fake grief. For 5 years, he'd lived in a carefully constructed prison of obligation and loss, sending money to support a lie while struggling to raise his daughter with dignity. The woman who'd created this prison was 20 minutes away, pregnant with another man's child, building a life funded by his sacrifice. The choice Marcus was offering wasn't really a choice at all. It was a chance to reclaim reality, whatever the cost. Schedule the meeting, Jerome said, his voice steady for the first time in years. I want them to know that Jerome Williams isn't anybody's fool anymore. The decision felt like switching on power after working in darkness, illuminating corners of his life that had been shadowed by manufactured grief. Tomorrow would bring federal agents, criminal charges, and the systematic dismantling of elaborate fraud. Tonight, Jerome Williams was finally ready to stop mourning a woman who'd never bothered to die. Jerome made the call Thursday morning, his finger hovering over the send button for the monthly transfer like a man defusing a bomb. $300 remained in his account for the first time in 60 consecutive months. Instead of the familiar confirmation message, his phone displayed, "Transfer canceled by user." The words felt like the first honest thing he'd done in 5 years. Now came the waiting. And Jerome had learned patience from 20 years of electrical work where rushing meant getting burned. The response came at 11:30 with a call from Diane's number, the first time she'd initiated contact in months. Jerome let it ring 4 times, giving Marcus Reed's recording equipment time to capture every word. "Hello, Diane." His voice carried none of the deference that had marked their previous conversations. The woman on the other end sounded different too, sharper, more urgent, stripped of the grieving mother act she'd maintained for years. "Jerome, there's been some mistake with the bank transfer. I've been checking my account all morning, and the money didn't come through." Diane's words tumbled over each other with barely controlled panic. "I need you to call the bank and fix whatever went wrong. You know I depend on that money for medications, rent, everything." The desperation was real, but Jerome recognized it now as the panic of someone whose carefully constructed scheme was collapsing. "I'm having cash flow problems this month," Jerome replied, following the script he and Marcus had rehearsed. "My daughter needed emergency dental work, and the electric bill was higher than expected. I'll try to send something next week, maybe half the usual amount." The silence stretched long enough for Jerome to hear traffic in the background, street noise that didn't match the quiet residential area where Diane supposedly lived. "You can't just stop sending money without warning. Keisha made you promise to take care of me, and that means every month, the full amount." Her voice had transformed from weak elderly woman to something harder, more calculating. "If you're having money problems, get a second job. Take out a loan. I don't care what you have to do, but that money needs to be in my account by tomorrow, or there's going to be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Jerome asked, genuinely curious how far she'd take the charade. Diane's breathing grew heavier, and he could hear her scrambling to regain control of a conversation that had spiraled beyond her management. When she spoke again, her voice carried the desperation that made people say things they'd later regret. "Keisha told me things about you before she died. Things about how you treated her, how you made her feel trapped in that marriage." Diane's voice dropped to a malicious whisper. "If you don't keep sending that money, I might have to share those stories with people. With your work, with Zara's school, with anyone who thinks Jerome Williams is such a good man." The blackmail attempt was pathetic and transparent, but it revealed something important. Diane was running out of options. Jerome almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "That's interesting, Diane, because I've been wondering about something myself." He let the pause stretch, savoring the moment when Hunter became hunted. "I drove by your old address last week, the one I've been sending money to. Funny thing, the people living there say no Diane Jefferson has ever received mail at that location. They've been forwarding packages to a different address for 3 years. Want to explain that?" The phone went dead, complete silence. Jerome looked at his screen to confirm the call had ended, then immediately dialed Marcus Reed. She hung up as soon as I mentioned the address discrepancy, but not before threatening blackmail and demanding I take out loans to keep sending money. You get all that? Marcus confirmed the recording was clean, then delivered news that made Jerome's pulse quicken with anticipation. FBI's interested, very interested. Agent Sarah Chen from White Collar Crime wants to meet tomorrow morning. Marcus's voice carried professional satisfaction. Between the insurance fraud, fake death certificate, wire fraud, and now attempted extortion, they're looking at a potential RICO case. This isn't just about you anymore, Jerome. They think your wife and her mother are part of a larger